ladies and gentlemen. For those of you who don't know me, I am Dr. Eugenia de Muro, the Acting Director of the Australian National Centre for Latin American Studies. And in this capacity, I welcome you to tonight's public lecture. Before I formally introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to mention some of the events that are coming up in UNCLAS. Next week we have a book launch, the book launch of Esteban Bedoya's novel, The Apocalypse According to Benedict. Esteban Bedoya is the head of mission of the Paraguayan Embassy in Australia, and he's also an accomplished writer whose work has been translated to various languages. The launch will take place on April 23rd, so that's next Tuesday from 6:30 here at the Tank. On May 2nd, we have a lecture on Latin America and the UN Security Council by Richard Hadwig, who is Professor of Political Science at Texas A&M University, Kingsville. Professor Hardwick is currently an UNCLAS visiting fellow as well. The lecture will take place at Manning Clark Lecture Theatre 4 at 6:30 on the 2nd of May. So for more information on these and other events, and we have a whole heap of them, please check the UNCLAS website. Tonight's lecture will be followed by a Q&A session with Professor Catherine Travis, and then we will be serving some refreshments in the foyer. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you tonight's speaker. Professor Catherine Travis is Chair of Modern European Languages and Deputy Head of School in the School of Language Studies here at the Australian National University. She joined the school in 2012, having come from the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, where she worked for 10 years. Her primary research areas are Hispanic linguistics and bilingualism, and she is currently examining the language contact situations of Spanish speakers in Australia and in the US. We're very fortunate to have Professor Catherine Travis with us here tonight. So on behalf of UNCLAS, I thank you for agreeing to participate in the UNCLAS lecture series and for sharing your research with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Eugenia, and thank you, UNCLAS, for this invitation and this opportunity to share my research with you. Before I launch into the main theme for tonight, I'd like to contextualise it a little bit in terms of the larger research project in which it sits, which is looking at Spanish as spoken in Australia. And what I'm interested in this research is looking at what happens to the grammar of Spanish over time as it's spoken in Australia by bilinguals in contact with English. Does it change? Does the grammar change to look more like English? Is one question that I'm interested in. And another question that I'm interested in is, what about the dialect contact? In Australia, we have Spanish speakers coming together from many different parts of the Spanish-speaking world, and they don't all speak the same Spanish. So I'm interested in what goes on. If you've spent 20 years speaking with a Chilean, even though you're from Argentina, do you start speaking like a Chilean or not? And this is a project that I'm just launching. This is the website up here. And so what I'm going to present today is kind of a precursor to this project. So as a first step, I'm trying to understand a bit of the makeup of the Spanish community in 2011, basically, because I'm basing it on the census from 2011. So Australia in 2011 is certainly a multicultural country. The 2011 census, which is the most recent census, showed us that close to 20% of the Australian population speaks a language other than English in the home. So this is almost 4 million people who speak approximately 250 different languages. Where does Spanish sit in this? Well, Spanish is a small portion. There are 117,500 Spanish speakers in Australia. So this is just 0.6% of the Australian population, and 3% of those who speak a language other than English in the home, or what I'll be referring to as community languages. Not only is this community relatively small, it's also quite diverse. These speakers come from approximately 20 different Spanish-speaking countries. So it's quite a mix, and it's an open debate as to whether or not these do actually form one community or whether we have many different communities. And certainly I think, I hope that those of you here would agree with me that we can't talk about any kind of Spanish type of Chinatown or Little Italy having emerged in Australia, but there certainly is a vibrant community, and for members of that community there are many areas where they can get together with others and socialise and integrate their children into the Hispanic cultures. So here are just some photos of the Spanish-speaking world across Australia. So the first one there in the top left for you guys is of the Chilean festival in Melbourne that's held every year in September to celebrate Independence Day. It gets 10,000 people or more attending. It's run over a weekend. It's a very big, one of the major events for the Chilean community and for the Hispanic community in general. Here we have a photo of the Spanish Quarter, the Spanish Club in the Spanish Quarter in Sydney, on so-called Spanish Quarter, on Liverpool Street, and you can see the sign for the Spanish Club with flags of several different Spanish-speaking countries, so they're seeking to appeal and attract a wide audience. The photo in the bottom right is a photo of a Latinos camping, and I hope you can see here the tents and the Latin flags in amongst the Australian bush. This is a camp that takes place every year near Glen Rowan, and this year there were 1,500 people there from across the Latin American world over Easter, and over 3 days there's music at night and games for the children during the days and all sorts of events. And finally, another very important aspect of the Spanish-speaking community is the community schools. And this is a photo taken from a school here in Canberra, Osito School. It has just started up, that's offering Spanish classes for Spanish kids. And on this day, they arranged to have a Mexican dance group come in and show the kids Mexican dancing, which was a huge hit. So, who are Australian Spanish speakers and how can we find out? What I'm going to present to you today is based on the census conducted most recently, as I said, in 2011. And I'd like to thank Leah Hall for her help last year in extracting several bits of the information that I'll show you today. There are several limitations with working with this kind of data that I will talk about as we go through, but it does give us a nice general overview. So the census consists of 60 questions. The ones that are of particular interest to me are few. One of them is, in which country was this person born? And this is what will indicate first generation immigration. So if somebody says they were born in Chile, we know that they're a first generation immigrant to Australia. There is another question that I don't have here, but that asks, what year did you arrive in Australia? So that's also very relevant because it tells us something about trends over time. So this will tell us first generation immigration. Unfortunately, for the census from 2001, we cannot get information about second generation immigrants because it has not asked in what country your parents were born. The current census, the 2011 and 2006 census, only asked, was your mother born in Australia or overseas? Father Australia or overseas? So if you speak Spanish, and your mother was born overseas, then we could maybe assume that you're a second generation immigrant. But if you don't speak Spanish, if your parents are from Chile and you don't speak Spanish, you will not be identified on the census in any way. And the census takes submissions. They close their submissions on the 1st of May. So if there's anyone out who's interested in language maintenance, there are quite a few people I know that are putting in a submission to say, please put back in that question that asks about country of birth of parents, because we lose vital information if we don't have that question. Another question of great interest is, does the person speak a language other than English at home? So this question was introduced, or language type questions were introduced from 1976. Initially, they were more general. Do you speak a language other than English? This, of course, is less specific. You might be in second year French and you might say, yes, I speak French. So they've specified it at home, which from a linguistic point of view is good because we know that the home is the last domain of language loss. We know that immigrant communities tend to lose their language over generations, and the last place where it's retained is the home. At the same time, these figures are necessarily going to give us a conservative estimate because there will be many Spanish speakers who don't speak Spanish at home. They speak Spanish just fine with their parents from Argentina, but they've married an Australian or a Croat or someone from somewhere else and they don't speak English at home. So the numbers are necessarily conservative in that sense. Okay, so what do we get then? So firstly, looking overall at community languages in Australia, in 1991, 15% of the Australian population said that they speak a language other than English in the home. In 2011, this rose to 19%. So we've had quite a significant jump, and that's looking in proportions. If we look in terms of numbers, in numerical terms, the overall increase in the Australian population over this 20-year period has been 25%, but the overall increase in the number of speakers of community language has been 60%. So speakers of other languages are growing at a faster rate than speakers of English, largely because of increased immigration to Australia. What are these languages? So the top 10 community languages identified in the census in 2011 are given here in the pie chart and on the side with the percentages that they make up. 2011 was a very important year in Australian demography because it was the first year that Italian and Greek were pushed out respectively of first and second place. So Mandarin jumped up to first place, Arabic and Cantonese both passed Greek. You can see that Spanish is situated there at number 8. Arguably it should be in 7th place. The census collapses Tagalog and Filipino because they're both spoken in the Philippines, but they are separate languages. So if we take out Filipino, Spanish would be number 7. And representing about 3% of the speakers of community languages. If we compare this with 1991, so I've added there the percentage of the speakers of community language that speak these languages and the ranking, you can see that Mandarin has shot up phenomenally. In 1991, Mandarin represented 2% of our community languages. It now represents 9%. It was 13th place, now it's in first place. Italian and Greek, you can see, have gone down markedly. In 1991, Italian represented 17% of our community languages. It's now only 8%. Greek was 12%. It's now 6%. So in 1991, Italian and Greek represented close to a third of our speakers of community languages, and now they represent just about 15%. So big changes have happened over this 20-year period. So that's in terms of proportions of speakers of community languages. If we look at actual numbers of speakers, we get a bit more information about the situation. So this table gives the top 20 community languages in 2011, and the numbers of speakers in 2011, and the numbers of speakers in 1991, and the degree of change that they've undergone. So you can see that Spanish went up from 90,500 to 117,500. It went up by 1.3, so a slight rise in Spanish. Nothing compared with the increase that we've seen in Mandarin, Hindi and Korean. Hindi and Korean didn't turn up before because they don't make it into the top 10. But if we look in terms of top 20 and who's increasing the most, these guys are all increasing fourfold or more, really huge increases there. Notice all Asian languages. Next, I've grouped together languages that have increased by doubled, almost doubled, a bit more than doubled. Again, primarily Asian languages, so Tagalog, Filipino, Vietnamese, Indonesian, Cantonese. Arabic is also in this group. Serbian is the only European language in this group, but it's very likely that the reason why we have this increase in Serbian is because of a designation issue in 1991. It was also accepted as Serbo-Croatian. So the numbers have gone up because people are defining themselves differently. So basically, those languages that are rising by a lot are Asian and Arabic. Next, I've grouped together languages that are rising by a little bit. European languages, Turkish, Spanish, French. And then languages that are relatively stable or are dropping, and here we have European languages. So this is a nice sort of snapshot of this shift that we're seeing in the Australian immigrant demography. Punjabi and Persian right there down the bottom weren't even registered in 1991. They didn't appear as separate languages on the census, so we can assume that they have also gone up by an extremely large amount, but we don't know how much because they didn't appear at all. Okay, so let's now think about Spanish then. What about Spanish? So the 10 most well-represented Spanish-speaking countries in Australia are given here. So this is looking at first-generation immigrants. If we look at first-generation immigrants from across the Spanish-speaking world, this is what we get. So 1/4 of our first-generation immigrants come from Chile, 12% from Spain, Argentina and Colombia, 10%, 9% from El Salvador, Uruguay, Peru, And just a small amount, 3%, Mexico, Venezuela, Ecuador, and then others. We have some Puerto Ricans, Costa Ricans, Guatemalans, but very, very few. So if we do a similar kind of comparison to what we did last time, is also very interesting. If we have a look at what the distribution looked like in 1991, and you can see that it's changed quite a lot. So Spain, for example, in 1991 represented 20% of the first generation immigrants from the Spanish-speaking world. It's dropped down to 13, so dropped by a third. A lot. Chile, Argentina and Uruguay have all dropped slightly, and so this is the southern cone region, all undergone small drops. In 1991, 75% of our first generation immigrants from the Spanish-speaking world came from Spain and from the southern cone, and now 59% come from that region. So we're seeing a shift away from that region, and I'll talk about the history of this in a moment. The others have all risen. Colombia has risen enormously. It was 3% of the first generation immigrants, now it's 12%, so fourfold proportionally. Peru has almost doubled, Mexico threefold, Venezuela threefold, and Ecuador has doubled. So we're seeing a lot more from northern South America, a lot less from southern cone. Another way to look at this, to sort of think about it from a slightly different perspective, is looking at distribution according to year of arrival. So in this graph, we're disregarding the numbers of speakers. We're just taking all of the Spanish, all of the people born in Spain, all of the people born in Uruguay, all of the people born in Chile, and having a look to see when did they come, what proportion came when. And so I've grouped this into 3 different periods. If we start off looking at Spain, you can see that 50% of immigrants from Spain arrived prior to 1971. And Spain, the immigration from Spain was largely the post-war immigration, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And a small proportion in this latest period, 1992 to 2011. Uruguay, Chile and Argentina all look very similar. This is the southern cone region. So very little before 1971, the bulk of the immigration from this region was from 1972 to 1991, and I'm going to go through the steps in more detail in a minute. And very little immigration in the last 20 years from Uruguay. 20% of the Chileans in Australia came in the last 20 years, and close to 30% of the Argentinians came in the last 20 years. Oh. El Salvador, we have a very different picture again. El Salvador, 80% of the Salvadorians came in the period between 1972 and 1991, and just 20% came since then. And Colombia, here we can see the explanation for this sharp rise that we saw in the pie chart from 1991. 80% of the Colombians have arrived just in the last 20 years. And you can peruse the other results yourselves to try to keep things contained. I'm just going to focus on these 6 countries for the rest of the talk, and I apologise for the Peruvians in the audience that I left Peru out. Last minute crunch decision. Okay, so let's now have a look over time from 1921 and sort of chart the growth and the changes in our Hispanic population. So here what you have is the number of first generation immigrants at these different periods of time. So the blue line represents Spain, the purple line represents Chile, and I'll go through them one by one. What you need to understand here is that when it rises, it means that immigration is continuing. This means that the number of speakers is the number of first generation immigrants from that country is going up. Because the people who arrived in 1961, we assume that most of them are still there in 1971. And so if it goes up, that's because of increased immigration. Okay? Of course, some of them may have returned, and I will talk about that. If it's stable, it means that we're not receiving much immigration from that country. And if it goes down, it means that the people from that country are leaving, usually going back to their home country. Sometimes it's an older population and they're dying, so their numbers are dropping. You'll notice that all of the Latin American countries only start from 1971. This is because prior to then the census didn't ask for or didn't record the Latin American country. It just grouped them all together. So we don't have that information. We can only talk from 1971. But you can see that even in 1971, it was pretty minimal. There was not a huge amount of Latin Americans. Most of the first generation immigrants were from Spain. Okay, so let's focus on Spain then for the moment. So we've had Spaniards in Australia for a long time. The 1800s attracted some because of the gold rush. Some went to cut sugarcane in Queensland, formed communities near Ingham in Queensland. But it was pretty minimal, and in 1947, the census registered 992 Spaniards, and you can see that that's pretty much the same as 1921. So we had very low numbers prior to 1947. In 1948, Australia introduced assisted migration from Europe, which is when we started to receive many, many post-war refugees. And so this is when many of the Greeks, Italians, etc. all came in. The agreement with Spain was signed relatively late. It was signed in 1958, but this brought in a lot of immigration from Spain in that period, but only briefly. In 1963, the agreement was suspended due to poor employment conditions in Australia, a dispute. And the agreement was suspended for 5 years. And according to Daniel Martin, this is a period when there was massive immigration from Spain. And if this period hadn't happened to be the period that the agreement was suspended, we would see similar numbers of Spanish speakers in Australia, Spaniards in Australia as we do of Italians. But there was just this blip in the map that had a major effect on Spanish in Australia. You can see that from 1971 it became very stable, so immigration stopped coming in. There are a couple of events this time that happened in Spain that had an effect on this. Many of you might be able to guess. 1975, of course, the death of Franco brought greater stability to the region. Some Spanish returned in this time, fewer left. And 1986, Spain joined the EU, which to some degree improved conditions in Spain, but it also opened up Europe for the Spaniards. So some returned in that time, and you can see that dip for better conditions. Okay, so going on to the southern cone, which is Argentina, Uruguay and Chile. And so we're starting here from 1971 because that's when we have the data. You can see Argentina and Uruguay. So Argentina is the red line, Uruguay is the green line, followed very, very similar paths. And both of them are just at about 2,000 in 1971. A historical aspect that is, of course, of great importance to the history of immigration in Australia is the White Australia policy that was in place from 1901 to 1973, formally abolished in 1975, which made it very difficult for Latin Americans to come to Australia while that White Australia policy was in place. So that's perhaps one of the major reasons why we see very little immigration from Latin America prior to that period. In 1966, Australia introduced skilled immigration. They opened this up to non-Europeans. They needed more workers, and so this was the way of attracting them. And so this opened things up a little bit for Latin Americans. And in 1967, they allowed immigrants from Europe who had spent at least 5 years in Latin America to come on to Australia. So this means that in the case of all of these southern countries, but particularly Argentina and Uruguay, we have quite a few immigrants from those countries that had originally come from Europe. Italians in particular, Germans, Poles, Spanish. And these people also throw out our statistics a little bit because many of them might have actually been born in Spain, but grew up in Argentina, feel Argentinian, but they write on the census that they were born in Spain, and so we're registering them as Spanish when in fact their identity is more Argentinian. That's just an example of the kind of data that we lose. So the early immigrants from these regions were often these immigrants that had come from Europe. The main period of immigration from Argentina and Uruguay that I've grouped together because they're very similar histories is in the 1960s and 1970s. Great economic upheaval, particularly in Argentina, enormous inflation, and unemployment in both countries, and of course military dictatorships, the dirty war in Argentina, all of this sent people looking for respite elsewhere. Many of them came on an assisted package from the Australian government, so they helped them with their transport, helped them a little bit setting up in Australia, and they arrived to stay in hostels, in government hostels. And from there, when they moved out of the hostels, they tended to move into the surrounding suburbs, the surrounding areas. So we get Argentinians, Uruguayans, and Chileans to some degree also clustering quite a bit. Fairfield is the big main area where we find them clustering. In the 1980s, we saw a restoration of some kind of democracy in these countries, a bit more economic stability. If you look at the curves, you can see Argentina, the red curve, is very stable from the 80s and a slight rise recently. And Uruguay was very stable from the 80s, in fact, with a slight decline. So either it's the ageing population or people are returning to Uruguay. In fact, most likely it's a combination of both of those. So Chile is slightly different from its southern cone neighbours, and we can divide up the Chilean immigration into three general waves. One from 1968 to 1970, where there was enormous economic and political turmoil, the last couple of years of the Frei government before Allende took power. And in this period, we had some highly educated middle-class Chileans immigrating to Australia. From 1970 to 1973, the Allende government is talked about as the first Marxist government in Latin America. So this, again, sent away the educated, the wealthy. So you can see by 1973, from the figures that I've got there, we get up to about 3,500 Chileans in Australia, mostly this educated, relatively wealthy middle class. From 1973, it's quite different. In 1973, there was, of course, the military coup. Pinochet took power. And we see very different kind of migration. We see some refugees and we see family reunion going on. And so we have less skilled workers and less wealthy. So different demographic across these different periods of the Chilean immigration. And the Chileans that I've spoken to certainly recognise the division of these groups. So important events that had a role in this, of course, were the 1975, the final abolition of the White Australia policy, the official abolition by the Whitlam government. And in 1981, the introduction of the special humanitarian program for refugees, where Australia greatly expanded its refugee intake, and so many of the Chilean immigrants came in under that scheme, as well as the family reunion that I mentioned. Okay, so moving way north, Central America, El Salvador. El Salvador just gets this little stretch. It wasn't registered. It was registered in 1986, but I've gone for 10-year segments, so you don't see 1986. 1986, there were just a couple of thousand Salvadorians in Australia. The source of the Salvadorian immigration was the Salvadorian Civil War from 1979 to 1982, and it's quite mapped out quite well there, I think, on that period of immigration. So huge number, well, the vast majority came in under this special humanitarian program that I mentioned in the last slide, was introduced in 1981, or expanded in 1981. The first arrivals came in 1983, and there were 75 political prisoners who were released under amnesty, and the Salvadorian president asked Australia to please take them because he wanted to get rid of them. In the 1990s, we had 10,000 Salvadorians arrive, and that's pretty much all that came, and they've stopped coming. You can see as things are, in at least politically, to some degree, more stable over there. So while for the Chileans we saw a division, the earlier immigrants were more wealthy, more middle class, well educated. The later immigrants were less so. The Salvadorian community, primarily refugees, so unskilled and have little English, so quite a different demographic there. And then finally, Colombia. In the 1960s, we had Colombians beginning to come to Australia under assisted packages for skilled workers, and then following on from that, family reunion. But you can see it was very, very small, and even up to 2001, we only had about 4,000 Colombians in the country. From 2001 to 2011, where the numbers have really shot up from about 4,000 to about 12,000, what we've got coming in is many, many skilled workers and many students. So a very different group. And this is due to very poor economic conditions in Colombia, unemployment, little opportunities for the educated who've managed to get themselves a university degree and then they can't get a job. So they come to Australia. To Australia's great benefit, of course, and to these countries' enormous loss in terms of the intellectual drain. So, from what we've seen then, if we think in terms of the sort of policy changes in Australia, we've seen a reduction in the family reunion scheme, we've seen a reduction in the humanitarian program for refugees, and what we've seen is increased focus in skilled labour and increased focus in students who of course pay international fees. So the new immigrants who are coming in are skilled and are middle class and above. It's a very different group from what we've seen historically. I'll quote my colleague Daniel Martin, who wrote in 2002, and it's just even more the case now, the profile of the immigrant to Australia for the new millennium is that of someone with a high level of education, good knowledge of English, a high degree of skills and experience, and enough money to get by for 2 years should they not find work. So that's really exactly what we're looking at, and that's what we can chart very nicely as we look at the changes that have gone over time. So what does this mean then for Spanish in Australia? If the immigrants that we're seeing, do we have it there? Good knowledge of English. So are they still going to be speaking Spanish at home or not? It's a question that I don't have an answer to, but that I'm very interested in. So let's think briefly then about Spanish in Australia. So this pie chart gives you the country of birth of Australian Spanish speakers. So the pie chart that we saw earlier was the distribution of people from the Spanish-speaking world, whether or not they speak Spanish. Here we're looking at people who said they speak Spanish and what country they said they were born in. Okay? So the big addition here is, of course, Australia. 31%, about a third of those who speak Spanish in Australia today are born in Australia. Now, some of these will, of course, be people who have studied Spanish and learned it, who've married Spanish speakers, and some of them will be second-generation immigrants. We've got no way of knowing got no way of breaking that down the way the census is set up currently. But we can assume, I think, that the majority would be second-generation second-generation immigrants. If we compare this with the figures that we saw earlier, looking now at the most well-represented countries of birth, so looking at first-generation immigrants, you can see that in general we've got the expected drop. So 25% of our immigrants from the Spanish-speaking world are born in Chile, and 18% of our Spanish speakers are born in Chile. Right? Does that make sense? So in general, for most of the countries, we've got a drop of around about a third or a quarter, which is exactly what we'd expect because close to a third of Spanish speakers are now born in Australia. The big drop is in Spain. Spain, we have 13% of our people from the Spanish-speaking world are born in Spain, but only 7% of our Spanish speakers are born in Spain. So that's a drop of nearly a half, which is more than what we would expect. And I would hypothesise that this is largely because of the time that Spanish has been spoken, that the Spaniards have been in Australia. We can see this also if we look at first-generation immigrants who speak Spanish at home. So what this graph shows you is those people who were born in Spain, the blue is the percentage of them that speak Spanish at home and the red is the percentage that speak English at home. And what you can see mirrors exactly what we've seen for the history, exactly what we've seen throughout. Spanish has the lowest proportion. So of those born in Spain, about 75% of them speak Spanish in the home. 25% speak English. Next, our Southern Cone fellows, Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, very similar, 80%, slightly above 80% are speaking Spanish at home. El Salvador is quite high. El Salvador is close to 90, slightly above 90%, and Colombia just below 90%. So this first language retention is mirroring very nicely the period of time that these people have been in Australia, which is very interesting because it shows that even for first-generation immigrants, period of time in Australia has a tendency to make you lose your Spanish, not speak Spanish at home, not lose your Spanish. Presumably these guys still speak Spanish, but they don't speak it at home. Some of them may not speak it at all. There was one other point that I was going to make about it's gone. So, I will move to closing then. So, the future of Spanish in Australia will definitely rely on continued immigration. That was the point I was going to make. Because the first generation, we assume overall tend to speak Spanish. Second generation, we know, linguistic research across the world has shown us that second generation tend to lose it, and by the third generation, it's generally gone. This is a pattern that happens across the world. So we really do need continued immigration from the Spanish-speaking world to keep up our Spanish in Australia. And wherever we can, the retention of Spanish by the second generation. And so then we can ask the question, which I won't answer, but this is where I'm going with my research project, is what will Australian Spanish look like? What will the Spanish of those second generations who do retain it, and of those first generations who've been in Australia for 40 years, what does their Spanish look like? Is it some kind of Anglified Spanish, that's been hugely influenced by English, a kind of Australian Spanglish? Certainly the research from the US suggests that this notion of Spanglish is actually a bit of a myth, and although immigrants in bilingual situations, people tend to borrow many, many words, the grammar of the language tends to stay very neatly intact, despite many, many years of contact. So that would be interesting to see. And then and in terms of the dialects, is it just a hodgepodge, bit of Chilean here, bit of Spanish there, bit of Argentinian there? Chileans are the biggest number, maybe everybody starts speaking like the Chileans. Colombians are growing, maybe everybody will start speaking like the Colombians. This is the research question that I hope to maybe be able to tell you about in a couple of years' time. So, gracias. People in Australia now have ready access to any number of Spanish newspapers, not just newspapers, soapies from Latin America, and the members of the community watch these avidly, and so and you know, news, all sorts of things, access to things that they didn't have access before. Even much easier phone access, of course, because phone calls used to be incredibly expensive. So this is hopefully a positive thing in terms of retention of the language and in terms of acculturating your kids into the culture as well. And people have talked a lot about language maintenance being tied to, it's a value. It's a value of the community to retain their language. And I think there's a lot of sense in that, but it's something that you absolutely cannot, well, I would say you cannot, it's very difficult to empirically measure that kind of thing. But what you can look at is how much they cluster together, sort of ethnic enclaves. You know, wanting to be tied to the community may well be one reason why you would live in an ethnic enclave. So I think that those factors are quite intertwined. With Spanish, it's actually quite hard to get at that because the numbers are so small that it's very hard to get any kind of critical mass. So the largest local government area, which is what the census breaks things down to, is Fairfield. And let me try to remember, I think it's 4% of Fairfield speak Spanish, and that's the largest area where we get Spanish speakers together. And that represents, or I could have it backwards, but I think that's 6% of the Spanish-speaking community. So it's a fair proportion clustered together, but it's, I said at the start of the talk that there's nothing like a kind of Spanish equivalent of Chinatown or Little Italy, and we need a lot more numbers to do that. But I think definitely looking at who these people are marrying is another thing that people look at a lot, and looking at those, yeah. And Fairfield is also interesting because Fairfield is an area where I think, if I remember rightly, that I'm thinking it must be the wrong way, but I think it's something like 80%, no, it must be 20% of Fairfield. No, I think it's 80% of Fairfield doesn't speak the language in the home. It's the most linguistically diverse government area in Australia. And in fact, I was looking on the Fairfield Council website, and they put out this newsletter 4 times a year, and of a sort of 16-page newsletter, on about 4 pages there were notices in about 6 different languages. Arabic, Spanish, Italian, Chinese, I didn't bring it along because I couldn't figure out some of the languages, but we suspect it was Assyrian and Khmer, which are not big languages in Australia, but big languages in Fairfield. So that kind of area is really fascinating to look at. Yeah. For the Chileans, I mean, there's the huge numbers. So the Chilean kids have other Chilean kids to play with. The Colombian kids will maybe have more Colombian kids later on, but the Argentinian kids, aren't having that many Argentinian kids to play with right now. So who would go and
how would they practice?
learn? How would they practice? How would they? So sheer numbers is one issue. The other issue is the period, the circumstances in which they immigrated. If the Salvadorians came in through this very traumatic time for their country. And they're relatively recent, so it's very difficult to tease apart those different kinds of factors. Yeah, religion is another factor actually that's quite closely tied in with this whole issue of values, and they say that communities that have a religion that's closely, deeply religious communities that where the language is closely tied to the religion is another factor in language maintenance. So Arabic is an example of that, and possibly Spanish Catholicism as well, the Catholicism in relation to Spanish. One of the things absolutely key to the kind of research that I would do is collecting all sorts of demographic information, right? What year did they come to Australia? Had they lived in other Spanish-speaking countries? Who are they married to? But also, what telenovelas do they watch? What newspapers do they read from what country? No, we get there are many, many more Spanish speakers in Sydney than there are in Melbourne, about twice as many. You can see up here, and I've got 42% of the Spanish-speaking population is in Sydney and only 24% in Melbourne. And given that Sydney represents around about 22% of the Australian population overall, we've got many, many, many more, proportionally more Spanish speakers in Sydney, and particularly that sort of Fairfield area. Melbourne, they're much more spread out. I have that graph as well. I took all these out at the last minute. But this is the darker the red, the greater the concentration of speakers. It doesn't have anything to do with numbers of speakers, it's just the proportion. And you can see that Melbourne has much more spread out distribution, whereas Sydney is more concentrated in Fairfield and those surrounding areas. In Melbourne, we're sort of over on the east and over on the west. So if we have close to 20% of the Australian population speaking a language other than English, and if this is rising, then this group is going to have a pretty big effect on Australia. It has a big effect, and it will have an effect in the future. Cultural identity is not, they don't ask in the census about cultural identity, so you couldn't do this kind of broad-scale study on cultural identity. They do ask ancestry, which actually I think is much more reflective of cultural identity than anything else in Australia. If you look at the Spanish speakers in Australia, well, actually all immigrants, many of them who are born in Australia will write Australian ancestry. So second generation immigrants, many of them identify as Australian. Latin Americans, many of them identify as Spanish. So you can't pull those out. So I think that ancestry is to some degree, do you identify as Australian or do you identify as something Hispanic if you lump together? If you definitely couldn't pull them apart, but if you lumped together all of the Spanish-speaking countries and people who identified their ancestry as from one of those, I think that would tell you something about identity. I think that would be very interesting to look at, but I think you've got more of a hodgepodge there than you have if you look at Spanish speakers, because we could also have Indigenous people from Chile identifying as Chilean, for example. We could have people who really do feel Italian, really do feel Australian, don't speak any Spanish, never go to the Spanish festival, but they write that they're in Chile. So I think those figures are much more nebulous, and I think that language is something that's much more concrete that we can grab onto. And so then I think we could say that in a sense, I'm assuming that if they speak Spanish, they have some kind of Spanish identity of some sort, if you wanted to go that way, given that obviously the two are sort of intrinsically linked. And language is something that's directly measurable, so I would say looking at the speakers is the best way to get at that, rather than looking at ancestry or country of birth. Well, country of birth, it's the same thing. I mean, if they're born in a country but they don't speak the language, we can, and Spanish speakers are problematic in their own ways, but other There are people born in Singapore. That tells us very little about the language that they speak, which I think is, as I said, is more tied to their cultural identity. And so if we use language as a measure of some kind of ethnic identity for this very broad-based scale, then we can have a look at what is going on with these groups, how are they integrating into Australia. And I haven't talked about any of the demographics today in terms of the kinds of jobs that these people do, the kinds of salaries that they earn, the education level, all these social measures. But if we look at that, then we can say, oh, look, you know, the Spanish speakers are doing really well in Australia. What's the secret? Let's use that to help the Italians or whatever, to understand the sort of how immigrants get ahead in Australia and what Australia needs to do to help them do that.
All right, so we'll continue the discussion outside in the foyer. I'd like to thank Professor Catherine Travis for her insights about the Spanish community in Australia. So can we please give her a round of applause?